Can you imagine waking up one morning and discovering that someone is building a huge metal structure right on your property without ever asking your permission? No warning, no notice, nothing. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And the way I handle my overreaching homeowners association is a story you definitely won't want to miss. It all began a few years ago. I own a nice piece of land, a few peaceful acres located on the edge of our subdivision. It's my quiet retreat, my little corner of calm away from the crowded neighborhood streets. One morning, I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking my coffee and looking out the window like I usually do. Suddenly, I noticed something strange happening out in my field. There were construction workers moving equipment around and setting up machinery. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I rushed outside and walked straight up to them, demanding to know what they thought they were doing on my land. The foreman looked surprised by my reaction and handed me a work order. And guess whose name was signed at the bottom? My HOA president, Karen. Yes, her name really was Karen, according to paperwork. The crew had been hired to install a brand new cellular tower right there on my field. I was furious. Without wasting a second, I drove straight to the HOA office, which, in reality, was just Karen's dining room where she handled association business. I confronted her immediately. Karen didn't look worried at all. In fact, she had this smug little smile on her face as she calmly explained that the HOA board had voted to approve the construction of the tower because cell phone reception in the neighborhood was poor. She claimed that a clause in the HOA bylaws allowed the board to make necessary improvements on common areas and even on adjacent properties if it benefited the entire community. And since my field sat next to the neighborhood road, she insisted it counted as adjacent property. I told her that was completely ridiculous. There was no way they could just build whatever they wanted on my private land. Karen simply shrugged and told me that if I had a problem with the decision, I could bring it up with the board. But the project had already been approved and construction would continue. I left that conversation feeling absolutely powerless. Here was a group of neighbors, led by a power-hungry HOA president, simply bulldozing over my rights. I knew I needed to do something, but the idea of starting a legal battle sounded exhausting, expensive, and time-consuming. So I went home angry and frustrated. For the next few days, I watched as the structure slowly rose higher and higher above my once peaceful field. Each time I saw that metal tower growing taller, my blood pressure went up a little more. Then one evening, while reading through the HOA bylaws for what felt like the 10th time, searching for anything that might help me fight back, I suddenly had an idea. It was risky, but it was also brilliant. You see, the land technically wasn't in my personal name anymore. A few years earlier, my lawyer had recommended that I transfer the property into a limited liability company, an LLC, for tax and liability purposes. I was still the sole owner and manager of the company. But legally speaking, the land belonged to the LLC, not to me as an individual homeowner. And that tiny detail was about to become Karen's biggest mistake. So I waited. I let the construction finish completely. The tower took about 2 weeks to build from start to finish. Once the final worker packed up and left, I finally set my plan in motion. I created an official invoice using my LLC's letterhead. The invoice was addressed directly to the HOA. The description was simple. Land lease, telecommunications tower, first month rent. The amount due? $5,000. I personally delivered the invoice to Karen's house and slipped it into her mailbox. Honestly, I would have loved to see her reaction when she opened it. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Karen, and she was absolutely furious. She was yelling about how outrageous it was, how I had no right to charge them money, and how the HOA had authority over the property. I waited patiently while she finished her angry speech. Then I calmly explained the situation. Karen, I said, you're correct that the HOA bylaws may allow improvements on property owned by a resident, but you didn't build that tower on my personal property. You built it on land owned by a private corporation, my LLC, and that corporation has absolutely no obligation to follow HOA rules. I continued explaining that they had technically trespassed onto corporate property and constructed a permanent structure there. So you have two options, I told her. Option 1, Pay the monthly lease fee of $5,000 for the use of the land. Option 2. Remove the tower entirely and also compensate my company for the damage done to the property. Suddenly, the line went completely silent. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she realized she had walked straight into a legal trap. After a moment, she mumbled something about speaking with the HOA's lawyer and hung up. The following week was incredibly tense. Word around the neighborhood was that the HOA had called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Apparently, their lawyer confirmed exactly what I had told Karen. The tower had been built on land owned by a corporate entity, not an individual homeowner, and the HOA bylaw Karen relied on didn't apply. They were stuck. Their choices were simple: pay rent or spend a fortune removing the tower. So what did they decide? A few days later, a check for $5,000 appeared in my mailbox, made out to my LLC, and since then, that same check has shown up every single month. They tried to negotiate a lower rate at first, but I politely explained that the price was non-negotiable. I even added that due to market rate changes, the lease agreement included a 10% annual increase. They didn't have much choice but to accept. So now the very HOA that tried to bully me into giving up my land has become my most reliable tenant. That giant cell tower I once hated, it's basically my personal ATM. Every month it deposits a nice payment straight into my company account. And the funniest part? The neighborhood self-service is fantastic now. Meanwhile, every time I look out my window and see that tower standing in my field, I can't help but smile knowing it's helping pay for my vacations. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry. It's simply being smarter. And that's the story of how a massive headache turned into a very profitable opportunity. If you got a crazy HOA story of your own, feel free to share it in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about standing up to people who think they can push you around.